First, I would like to thank everyone for giving us an opportunity to bring this learning um, event to everyone. As Barb said, I'm a part of a team within SEAT. We are part of the Equity Engagement and Evaluation team, and we are part of the team that's kind of spearheading the efforts internally within our center. But as Barb stated, we have associates from each team that represents the rest of our teams that have really dug down deep and have begun doing the work of becoming an anti-racist organization, but also ensuring that that work is done outside of our center. And just for you all's understanding, the approach that we take is more of an intrapersonal position. So we recognize that once we as individuals understand in a greater way how racism operates and how we can be a part of not allowing that to operate, that's when we can really impact our community. I love that ODE released the framework for the whole child. As we were in the process of creating this presentation, we saw the framework had come out. And so it's just going to be by happenstance that some of the content that we're going to present aligns very much with that because we believe that it takes all of us to engage in this effort. And family engagement looks at it that way as well. It takes the community, it takes families, it takes schools to do this. And that's the position that we are going to bring today as we all engage in this learning. But also, we recognize that we all must remain culturally humble as we do this work, all of us. And what that looks like is that looks like us coming to the table saying, we don't know everything. Our partners don't know everything, but together we can learn together and make everyone's experiences that much better as it relates to being anti-racist. Next slide, please, Melissa. So, just by way of setting the tone, we just want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. We understand, or at least from our position here at SEAT, we really see race as a social construct that is just made real by the social consequences. So, it's something that has been created and it is maintained as a result of some of the consequences that have been associated with it across the years. Next slide. So we are taught fairly early to sort. If you think about your preschool years, if any of you have children, and then we have some of the students on today, we learn very early on to sort things. We sort blocks, we sort numbers, we sort colors, we sort people, we make pairs, we do those things. So we very much are trained, our eye is trained very early on to put things in a category. Next slide. And as we're learning, we're kind of maturing in those types of things. We also learn what we prefer and what we value. And oftentimes, we generally prefer or value things that are like things that we like or are like people. And I'll give you an example. My son is 19, but very early on, I remember he was maybe around a year old when he really started eating table food. And his pediatrician said, "Well, what vegetables does he like?" And I said, "Oh, he really likes green beans and he really likes corn." And she said, "Well, what else does he like?" I said, "Oh, I just think he really likes green beans and corn." And she said, "What do you like?" And I said, "I like green beans and corn." And she said, "Okay, you need to allow your child to make his own preferences by giving him a vast variety of fruits and vegetables so that he can decide what his preferences are." So my son, at a very early age, his preferences were shaped basically by what he was provided in our house. And so we do that as children, as parents, as humans. We we normally have something that we prefer, which sometimes creates a value in our mind. And we see it in education, we see it in activities, we see it in foods and those types of things. Next slide. So we have the sorting that we talked about, we have the preferences and the values, and then what we end up doing is we start making connections in our mind. We make very strong connections. So as you see, we have peanut butter and jelly on here. When I think of jelly, I almost always think of peanut butter. Now, I'll tell you, my husband is allergic to peanut butter. I don't know if he makes the connection with peanut butter and jelly. But we make very strong connections in our minds based off of some of the things that we've viewed, the experiences that we've had, and just kind of some of those early preferences that we have formed. Next slide, please. But did you know that some of our connections are inaccurate? Jelly goes with a lot of things. Jelly can go on crackers, jelly can go on different sandwiches. Some folks like jelly with eggs, and some folks like peanut butter with a variety of things. I actually love peanut butter, and I love peanut butter on anything you can think of. I like peanut butter cereal, those types of things. So peanut butter and jelly are not exclusive with each other. And for some people, those connections are not quite accurate. Unfortunately, we make these connections very early on. We oftentimes don't even know that the connections are made. And if they're inaccurate connections, it could be problematic. Any connection that we make, we often internalize. We get it in our mind, it's very strong. It impacts the experiences that we have, the perceptions that we have, and we have no idea that we're doing this in our mind. That is what we call implicit bias. When we form these really strong connections, there might be an attitude we have towards something or a group of people or various things, or we can also call them a stereotype. Those are those really strong, unconscious connections that we make. And in implicit bias, we typically go to the thing that we favor. Remember, we talked about the pairs and those types of things, colors, kind of categorizing things. Our implicit bias, our unconscious thoughts, almost always drive us to favor anything that we prefer. These thoughts sometimes are unknown to us. They're unfiltered, which means we've not had a chance to kind of really think them through. We don't really examine them, and we don't really change them unless we know that they're there. But guess what? They impact everything that we do. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the connections that we make as it relates to race and education. Many times, there has been a lot of research and a lot of personal experience that says that oftentimes, sometimes, that Black students are believed not to be as smart as white students. That's a connection that some folks have made in their mind, and they've continued with that. Some of the individuals that make these strong connections are in education, sometimes they're parents, sometimes they're students, and they're making these connections and it impacts their interactions with their peers. Sometimes it's individuals in the community. But there is a lot of research that says that this connection exists in the minds of some individuals, that Black students just aren't as smart as white students. Next slide. Let's really think about this though, because remember we talked about unfiltered, unexamined, strong connections and preferences. We have to offer ourselves other opportunities to determine if the implicit bias that we have in our minds are right. Did you know that race is often connected with poverty? And then poverty is always connected to how much money parents make. And our communities are often formed by folks who are like us. So I live in a neighborhood with individuals who make around the same amount of money that I do. And that schools receive some of their funding from the taxes that we pay. We know that urban students who are typically Black and brown live in communities where there is a high rate of poverty. But what we also know is that in those schools where we have predominantly Black students, those schools receive less funding because those neighborhoods have individuals who have less income. Oftentimes there are housing situations where houses are sold for a lesser amount of value. And so the money that the school receives from those property values are a little bit lower. Those schools generally have less qualified educators. So in urban schools that have predominantly Black students, those schools have teachers that don't have as much education or exposure as students would in a suburban district. The educators in urban schools are primarily white. One would think, oh, it's Black students, as Black educators. It isn't. It is primarily white teachers who have less experience as educators. Urban schools typically have curriculum that is not as rigorous. So that means that their curriculum is much easier than other school district that has suburban populations. Literature also says that in schools that serve mostly Black and brown students, that educators' expectations for those students are often lower than students that are not Black and brown. In those schools, those students also have less access to college preparatory classes and resources. So some of the students on here have already went to college, some are, going towards there. The students that we educate in predominantly urban schools generally don't have resources for ACT and ACT prep. Some of them don't even have the books for that. They may not have the ability to pay for fees for those. Then they also don't have access to a lot of those college prep courses or those AP courses or honors courses that you would find in other schools. And oftentimes, Black and brown students are suspended at higher rates than their counterparts, and many times it's without access to education while they are being suspended. And on top of that, these students generally experience more racialized experiences when they are in suburban schools. So when we think about those strong connections, we think about those preferences, we think about the way that we categorize, and we think about the fact that sometimes we think that Black students are not as intelligent as white students. We have to really think about a lot of these facts. And maybe the connections that we made in our mind are maybe not as accurate as we think. Next slide. This is how we begin to form racist thoughts when we have these thoughts that are unexamined, unfounded, but we continue to build on them. Our job is to interrupt those thoughts. What I just shared with you on the previous slide is me interrupting some of the thoughts that we might have as it relates to our Black students. And then our goal is really to make new connections that are more accurate so that we don't reinforce the inaccurate thoughts that we have in our mind. So you say, how do you do that? Next slide. So a very easy way that we can interrupt our own racist thoughts is to read, to listen, to learn, make connections, accept feedback, and act. We first have to educate ourselves around the ideas of race and education, and that's what we're doing today. So this is a step for most of us. When we are listening, we have to validate others' experiences because we know this. We prefer folks like us, and each person's experience is different. And so if someone is coming to you with an experience that's different than yours based on race, we listen and we validate that experience by saying, I hear you. Don't explain away someone else's actions or words. So if someone comes and says, I experienced this racist experience, we don't say, well, they probably didn't mean it that way, or maybe you took it a wrong way. We don't do that. We listen and we take that in and we sit with that information. We have to have tough conversations. I have to applaud my colleagues here at SEED. We've had some tough conversations over the last couple of months. We've had some conversations, but we have made a commitment that we will sit in those uncomfortable moments so that all of us in the future will be comfortable. We have to kind of create a racism zero tolerance environment where we're not going to tolerate it. We're not going to explain it away. We're going to say, this appears to be racist, and we're going to talk about it and move forward. And then we have to really engage in anti-racist behavior every day. We can't take a break from this work. We have to work on it daily. Next slide. So what I love about family engagement is that it's extremely proactive, but also very responsive. So as you all know, many districts have received a lot of like dear school letters over the last couple of months as our nation has kind of begun to grapple with this whole notion of race and discrimination and privilege and those types of things. Our students have begun to speak, not just our Black students, a lot of our students and parents have begun to say we've got to do something different. And so I just wanted to highlight that is beginning to engage in this anti-racist work. So Hilliard has 8.3% of its students' population are Black, and only 2% of the staff are white. So those are kind of interesting numbers, because what is that Black students typically do very well when they see individuals like them succeeding in spaces that they are in, and so those numbers are a little concerning, but there's hope. So Dr. Marchhausen from Hilliard is the superintendent, and he leaned into this work. He said, we're going to have these difficult conversations, and this is what he said. We're late, and as a society and as a country, we waited too long. We need to do differently and immediately put actions in place. He did not wait. He did not delay. There were no conversations around, should we be doing this? Or they moved immediately. They listened to the students. They heard their Dear Hilliard letters. They received feedback from parents. They received feedback from educators. And so they created a task force that is specifically designed to move the district towards a more anti-racist district. Next slide. So Beverly Tatum, she is a researcher who often researches race and education. She envisions anti-racist work as a walkway on in an airport. Some of us have flown before, and we know how these things operate. And so there's 4 different places that we can be on this walkway. And what I like about her framework is racism and moving towards an anti-racist position, we land on a continuum. No one's perfect. We all have to start somewhere. And so just moving forward is very helpful. So I want to explain this to you. We see the word active racist behavior. What that means basically is that we have identified that what we're going towards is racist. It maybe has some elements of white supremacy, and we are walking fast towards it on that conveyor belt. We're going head strong in front of that. A more passive racist behavior is you're on the walkway, but you're just going to stand still. So the conveyor belt is still moving towards kind of the racist behavior. And so you're really like a bystander on the conveyor belt, but you're still going towards a way that's not going to help all of us. The slow walking backwards is someone who turns around on the belt. They're not walking real fast, but they're kind of moving at a slower pace. But that person is also kind of still being carried back towards those racist behaviors. So they're not in an actively anti-racist stance. And then we get to the folks that eventually move on to this anti-racist stance. And those are individuals who have behaviors that includes aggressively walking away, intentionally engaging in behaviors that seeks to dismantle the racist acts and things that are going on. Those individuals get into the mix and they begin to make things happen to move towards a more anti-racist position. Next slide. So we don't want to live in denial, Ohio. Here is just some common comments that we hear often when we want to engage in this work. Well, I live in a rural community and we don't really have racial issues, so this doesn't really impact me. Or I live in a very diverse suburb and our student population is 25%. There is no way we have issues going on here. Or we don't have issues in our school because our population is predominantly Black. There's no mixing. So, you know, we have things together. Or as a community member, we can say I work in communities and with districts and they seem to be doing well addressing race, but maybe they aren't. Here's the major takeaway from this is that we don't want to have blinders on and not see race. It's here. We've all operated under it. It's now a reality for us. And the first thing we need to do is just acknowledge that race is a thing that has been created, has literally dominated every single thing that we do. We also need to understand that talking about race is a thing. It's something we should be having conversations about. It's happening. Our children are bringing up conversations about it. Our parents are. It's going on in different places. Let's just have a conversation. Talking about race is not a political thing. And some individuals feels like in education we shouldn't be talking about this. That's political. And in education, there's no space to talk about race. Well, what we know is this: educators teach academics, educators teach life skills. They typically teach students in ways that aren't as explicit, but educators are very much teaching how to interact with peers, what is okay, what is not okay, what is acceptable. So it very much is a part of education that we discuss and really have some real conversations around race. We have to have conversations that not only acknowledge race, we can't stop there. We have to have conversations about how has race benefited some and disadvantaged others. We have to have a balanced conversation. If it exists and there are consequences assigned to it, someone's getting consequences and someone is not. And to really have that conversation is where our students are requesting that we move to, our parents are requesting that we move to, and even our colleagues are requesting that we move to. Next slide. So let's talk about if we don't. Well, we know what happens if we don't. We've lived if we don't. We generally have kind of policies that are created in our schools that may not be as racially sensitive as they need to be. For example, there's a lot of conversation around kind of hair, and hair is very much for some students tied to their culture, tied to their race. Sometimes we inadvertently create policies around hair that really excludes some students. Sometimes we have classroom policies that really tend to exclude some students. I'm going to give you a really good example for this. We do a lot of group work. Now, I teach a graduate level class, group work in my graduate level class. Research has captured that in mixed race classrooms, there tends to be a lot of segregation. And generally, we go to who we like, who we prefer, our preference, those like us. We see students coupling up in groups that are often segregated by race. And what happens is we don't get to see the value that everyone brings to the groups. And many times when I say our students, Black students are excluded from contributing to the knowledge that's gained in the group, but also receiving that group knowledge. And one way that we can really handle that is by assigning group members, making sure that we're sensitive to the fact that we need to mix up our student population. We have unofficial policies all the time that impacts some of our Black and brown students that we've got to be more sensitive to. When we have group work, when we have classroom work, when we have classroom discussions, research has said that sometimes peers will censor peers. So we'll have discussions and peers can give a kind of their opinion, and their opinion is received and it's welcome. But research has said that sometimes when we have Black students in groups, their opinions are treated as facts, and they then are required to defend an opinion when other peers are not. That's called kind of censoring. Eventually, our students begin to just be silenced. They're present, but they're just not seen, they're not heard. And my own research has found that this causes our students a lot of distress, especially when it occurs across their whole educational experience. And so this is one of the reasons why we need to actively engage in race conversations. Next slide. So let's consider our position. We talked about family engagement. This looks like the Ohio Whole Child Framework. And so I just think this comes together very nicely. This is what I want us to really consider. Does our current position, or even our past position, honors family engagement, where we are concerned about the whole child, the whole family, the whole community, ensuring that all of our students have what they need to succeed. Are we preparing all of our students to grow and thrive and learn and push them towards their future? Is that what we are doing with our students now? And if not, I would say, what can we do to do that? Well, one of the ways we can, the most profound way that we can do that is to become an ally in anti racist work as it relates to our schools, our students, our families, our communities, and those that we touch and interact with. Next slide. So I'm hoping that you have now begun to think in your mind, what can I do? I have this information. Maybe you have been thinking about it before. Maybe this isn't the first thing that you have heard around this. But maybe you're thinking, well, what can I do to support moving towards a more anti-racist position? Because remember, we're not perfect. We're all learning. We're all growing. And we just need to start moving this way towards a more anti-racist position. And so what can we do? Next slide. I love the whole wraparound model. I love the idea of different organizations and structures wrapping around our families. This is why I fell in love with the whole child framework when I saw it. We can do this work, and we can do this work in multiple levels. If you remember, I told you at SEEP, we are really looking at kind of the inter and intrapersonal level, but we hope that after we do our personal work, that we can impact our institution and then impact our partners and our society. And we can do this in education as well by just wrapping around all of our families. Next slide, please. So, what can we do to support anti-racist work? Students, parents, educators, and communities. And so I would suggest that we really start thinking about past instances, conversations, experience where we've seen, heard, or maybe felt something was really impacted by race. For parents, I would like you to consider maybe experiences that you have had or your students have had, or they've come back to report that they have witnessed, and how maybe we could have been more supportive in that. I would like for educators to really consider the conversations and things that you've been engaged in thinking in new ways and how you can begin to interrupt those things by moving towards a more anti-racist behavior. And then community partners, we need you all in this fight to really begin to have some conversations around supporting our schools, our students, and even our organizations that impact these places into moving into more anti-racist behavior. Next slide. So we want to continue educating ourselves as it relates to race. Continue reading. There are podcasts, there are webinars, there are things online, there are conversations we can have with colleagues. I'm a person that believes if someone wants to have a conversation with me about race, I'm ready for it. Ask me any question. Learning about others' cultures are so very important in being culturally humble, but also being culturally sensitive. Sometimes the things that we do, the conversations that we have, are really based on the fact that we just haven't learned about all of our students' cultures. We can't be expert, but we can be a little bit more informed. We need to understand and learn about our own explicit bias, the things that we hold in our minds as stereotypes. I will tell you, in my class with my students, I have told them I carry a lot of connections that I know are inaccurate. There are certain people or certain groups that pop up in my mind when I hear certain things, and I have to tell myself, you got to make sure that's true. And I'm speaking as a Black woman. I have to do that and say, is this a bias that I'm carrying that's not quite real? So we have to really understand and uncover what connections we made, what preferences that we have, so that we can engage all of our families more appropriately. Be a role model. I want to take a stance that I'm going to be a role model in this anti-racist work. And if you want me to help you process through that, Let's do it together. Let's learn together. Let's move towards that anti-racist position together. And let's address racist acts when we see them. Let's not let them go unaddressed. We don't want our students, our families, our educators, our communities to feel like we are not sensitive to their needs. We are.